In 2017, a private equity firm named Gamut Capital Management signed papers in New York to buy the company behind one of America's most trusted Vise brands. Wilton wasn't struggling. Its factories were still running. Its name sat on workbenches nationwide, and mechanics had trusted it for generations. This was the third time in 20 years Wilton had changed hands. Each new owner valued the name more than the shop floor that built it. To understand how a street corner in Chicago became a line on a private equity balance sheet, you have to go back to 1941, back to a Czech immigrant standing on a sidewalk with no company name. Every week on this channel, we tell the story behind the brands that built the working world. If that's your kind of story, subscribe now, because this one starts with a man who didn't even have a name for his own company yet. His name was Hugh Vogel. He had just started a small tool business in Chicago, and he didn't even have a name for it yet. The story goes that a man walked up and asked him what his new company was called. Vogel looked up, saw a street sign, and said the first thing that made sense. The sign read, Wilton Avenue. His shop sat right at the corner of Wilton and Wrightwood. That's the whole naming story. No boardroom, no marketing meeting, just a man on a sidewalk borrowing the name of the street under his feet. Vogel wasn't chasing a big idea. He was solving a problem he'd seen up close in machine shops around the city. Bench vises at the time had exposed threads on the spindle, the screw mechanism that pulls the jaws together. Metal shavings, grit, and oil work their way into those exposed threads constantly during a normal day of work. Over time, the threads wore down. The vise got sloppy, and a tool that was supposed to hold a piece of metal rock steady started to slip. For a machinist trying to cut something to an exact measurement, a slipping vise wasn't just annoying. It ruined the work, and ruined work meant wasted material and wasted hours. Vogel designed something different. He built a vise where the spindle nut was completely enclosed, sealed away from dirt and metal chips. He shaped the whole assembly like a bullet, which is why it's still called the bullet vise today. The enclosed design kept the threads lubricated and clean. The pull on the jaws came straight through the center of the mechanism instead of off to one side. That centered pull mattered more than it sounds. A vise that pulls unevenly twists slightly as it tightens, and that twist throws off precision work. Vogel's design didn't twist. It just closed, straight and solid every time, whether it was gripping a thin sheet of metal or a heavy chunk of steel. He filed for a patent on this design in August of 1941, only months after starting the company. That's a fast turnaround for a small operation with no track record and no outside investors backing him. But before Vogel could find out whether machinists and mechanics across the country actually wanted his vise, the decision got taken out of his hands entirely. The United States entered World War II, and for the next 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, Wilton's vises weren't sold to the public at all. They went almost exclusively to the federal government, built for munitions plants that needed dependable tools clamped to workbenches around the clock, running shifts day and night. This created a strange problem for a young company. Wilton had a good product and a growing reputation inside factories that were building for the war effort. But it had almost no name recognition with ordinary machinists, garage mechanics, or hardware stores. When the war ended in 1945, Wilton wasn't collapsing, but it also wasn't a household name. It was a 4-year-old company that had spent its entire existence selling to exactly one customer, and that customer was about to stop buying at wartime volume. What saved Wilton wasn't the war contract itself. It was who touched that vise during the war. Thousands of machinists worked in plants where Wilton Vise sat on nearly every bench day after day, tightened down on parts headed for tanks, ships, and aircraft. Soldiers came home from the war and went to work in machine shops, auto garages, and factories, many of them having already handled Wilton tools during their training or their wartime jobs. When they needed a vise for their own workbench or recommended one to a shop owner hiring them, they already knew the name and trusted what it could do. The war didn't build Wilton's business directly. It built familiarity with an entire generation of skilled workers. And that familiarity is what turned into sales once the company could finally sell to the public again. Wilton made a deliberate choice after the war that shaped everything that followed. Instead of trying to sell through every hardware store in America, the company targeted the automotive supply distribution network, which was expanding fast as car ownership boomed across the country after the war. Auto parts stores and automotive supply houses became Wilton's main channel. That put the Vise in front of exactly the customers most likely to actually need one, mechanics and shop owners doing real repair work every single day. In 1950, Wilton expanded beyond the Vise itself, introducing its 540 series light-duty carriage clamps and its 900 series heavy-duty machinist clamps. These weren't small products. The heavy clamps were engineered to hold enormous force without failing or snapping under load. For a machinist, clamping down a piece of steel that was about to be cut or drilled, that kind of strength mattered. The clamp wouldn't be the thing that gave way and ruined the job, or worse, hurt the person operating the tool. 2 years later, in 1952, Wilton brought in new leadership to build out a serious industrial distribution network beyond the automotive channel. This is where the company's knowledge started passing between generations. People who had grown up around the business took on more of its expansion, learning the products from the inside rather than being handed a title. That kind of continuity is exactly the thing that keeps a company's original standards alive as it grows past what one person could oversee alone. By 1957, Wilton had outgrown its original Chicago location and moved manufacturing to Schiller Park, Illinois, a suburb with more room to expand production and add machinery. The move wasn't a sign of trouble. It was the opposite. Wilton needed a bigger plant because demand had grown past what the original shop could handle. The company was still independently run, still connected to the family that started it, just bigger and better equipped to keep up with orders coming in from across the country. The results showed up fast. By 1960, Wilton had become a recognized name across the industrial marketplace, and by 1965, it had become the preferred Vise brand among professional buyers in that market. When a shop foreman or a purchasing manager needed to order Vises for a new plant or a growing crew, Wilton was the default choice, not just one option among many on the shelf. In the late 1950s, the company also introduced the POW R-arm, a work positioner that held a piece steady for an assembly line worker, so both of that worker's hands stayed free for the actual job. Another sign that Wilton was supplying the industrial backbone of American manufacturing, one workstation at a time. This is the era people picture when they think of a Wilton Vise, bolted to a workbench in a garage, sitting in a machine shop next to a lathe, mounted on a farm workbench where a broken tractor part needed to be held steady while it got welded or filed down before the next planting season. The vise outlived the jobs it was bought for. Parts stayed available for years after a model stopped being made, and the design didn't need constant redesigning because the enclosed spindle worked exactly as intended, decade after decade, through heat, cold, and constant use. A mechanic who bought one in 1962 could still be using the same vise in 1990. He'd be tightening it down on parts for a completely different car than the one he was working on when he bought it. Part of what made that possible was the dealer and distribution system underneath the product itself. A mechanic who wore out a jaw insert or cracked a handle didn't need to replace the whole vise. He could order the specific part through the same automotive supply house that sold him the tool because Wilton kept components standardized across model years instead of redesigning them every season. That kind of consistency turns a customer into a habit. Once a shop trusted the parts pipeline, switching brands meant giving up years of built-up convenience, and most shop owners simply didn't bother. That loyalty didn't stay confined to working shops. Decades later, it resurfaced somewhere Hugh Vogel could never have predicted. Online forums, where collectors and machinists argue over Wilton history the way other people argue about vintage cars. On sites like Practical Machinist and the Garage Journal, longtime users trade scanned pages from decades-old catalogs. They're trying to pin down exactly when a swivel base or a particular clamp model first appeared, since the company's current corporate owners have never bothered to preserve or publish that history themselves. One collector spent years compiling patent numbers just to date his own vise. Another still has the original 1956 catalog listing the Wiltomatic Power Bench Vise, a model most current employees of the company have never even heard of. That kind of obsessive record-keeping doesn't happen for a tool nobody cares about. It happens when a machine earns the kind of loyalty that outlives the company that built it. But everything that made Wilton valuable also made it a target. A trusted name, a loyal customer base, a strong distribution network, and decades of manufacturing knowledge don't just serve customers. They also show up as assets on a balance sheet. That's the kind of asset that attracts buyers who are less interested in vises and more interested in what owning a respected brand can do for their business on paper. In 1994, Wilton Corporation, based in Palatine, Illinois, merged with Warren Tool Group, which owned the Columbian Vise brand along with several other tool companies. This combination made Wilton bigger and more diversified than it had ever been. It also made the company a more attractive target for a much larger buyer, since now a single purchase could deliver not just Wilton, but an entire portfolio of established tool brands in one transaction. That buyer arrived in 2002, WMMH Tool Group, the American arm of Walter Meyer. Holding, a company based in Switzerland, acquired the combined Wilton Tool Company and Warren Tool together. For the first time since Hugh Vogel stood on that Chicago sidewalk, the Wilton name belonged to a foreign parent company, sitting inside a portfolio that also included the Jet and Powermatic tool brands. The transaction price was never publicly disclosed, but the operational changes that followed were very visible to anyone paying attention. Manufacturing moved from Schiller Park to Carpentersville, Illinois, another Chicago area location, so the Vises were still being built in the region where the company started. But the decisions about that manufacturing were no longer being made by anyone connected to the Vogel family. They were being made inside a Swiss industrial group managing several unrelated brands at once. In 2008, the company moved its headquarters from Elgin, Illinois, to Laverne, Tennessee, outside Nashville. Wilton, a company born on a specific street corner in Chicago, no longer had any offices in Illinois at all. The ownership chain kept moving. In 2013, Walter Meyer decided to divest its entire tools division, selling the Jet, Powermatic, and Wilton brands to Tenex Capital Management, a private equity firm based in New York. The operating company was renamed JPW Industries. Tenex wasn't a tool company. It was an investment firm that bought businesses, improved their financial performance over a few years, and eventually sold them again for a profit. Wilton had gone from a family-run manufacturer to a division of a Swiss conglomerate to a private equity holding in the span of just over a decade. Then in 2017, 10X sold JPW Industries and the Wilton brand along with it to Gamut Capital Management, another New York private equity firm. This was the third ownership change since 2002, and the second time private equity specifically had taken control of the business. Each of these owners inherited the same trademark, the same catalog, and the same customer trust that Hugh Vogel had spent decades building brick by brick. None of them inherited a Chicago machine shop, a founding family, or the original manufacturing culture that created the Vise in the first place. Here's the part that complicates the obvious story. It's tempting to blame one villain for whatever happened to Wilton's identity afterward, but Wilton was never bankrupt, and it was never in financial distress when any of these sales happened. The real pattern isn't a single betrayal. It's a slow chain of ownership, moving the company further and further away from the people who actually understood how the product worked. Family control gave way to a multi-brand conglomerate. The conglomerate gave way to one private equity firm. That firm sold to another. Each step made sense financially to the people involved at the time, and each step also added distance between the decision makers and the factory floor where the actual work happened. That distance eventually showed up in the product itself. Starting around 2018, Wilton began shifting production of its tradesman line of Vises to Taiwan, and some models have been documented by buyers and dealers as coming from China as well. Longtime users and dealers have noted that the newer Taiwan-produced models rely on imported components throughout, in contrast to the American-sourced parts used in the U.S.-made lines. Some buyers and dealers have also reported that certain imported models carry shorter warranty terms than the lifetime warranty Wilton Vises were known for. This wasn't a total collapse, and it's important to be fair about what changed and what didn't. Wilton's machinist Vise line and its combination pipe and bench Vise line have continued to be built in the United States, sold right alongside the imported tradesman models from the same catalog. JPW Industries didn't abandon American manufacturing across the board. It split its product line, likely to compete on price against cheaper import competitors undercutting Wilton on cost. Whether that split was the right call is something longtime users still argue about in machine shop forums and tool collector groups, and reasonable people land on different sides of it. So where does that leave the company today? JPW Industries, still owned by Gamut Capital Management, still headquartered in Laverne, Tennessee, still sells Vises under the Wilton name to hardware stores, industrial suppliers, and online retailers across the country. The trademark is alive. The catalog is full. The reputation, built over 80 years of steady use in real shops, still carries weight with buyers who don't know or don't ask where a particular Vise was cast before it reached the shelf. What doesn't survive is the unified identity Wilton once had. That was a company where every Vise, regardless of model or price point, came out of the same American factory. Every one was built by workers trained under the same standards Hugh Vogel set when he sealed that first spindle against dirt and grit back in 1941. So did Wilton become America's Vise brand? Yes, and that part of the story is completely real and fully earned. Between 1941 and 1965, a Czech immigrant with no company name solved an actual mechanical problem that machinists dealt with every day. He survived a war that nearly kept his product out of civilian hands entirely, and built a distribution network that made his Vise the default choice in machine shops across the country. That achievement wasn't inherited or bought with someone else's money. It was built, one enclosed spindle at a time, by people who understood exactly what a shop worker needed from a tool that had to hold steady under pressure for decades of hard-repeated use. What Wilton is today is a different kind of achievement and a different kind of story entirely. It's a trademark that survived 5 ownership changes by staying valuable enough that every new owner wanted to keep using it, even while gradually changing what stood behind it piece by piece. The name outlived the company that built it, and the bullet-shaped Vise outlived the sidewalk conversation that gave it a name back in 1941, long after everyone involved in that conversation was gone. Picture 2 Vises sitting on the same modern workbench. One is an old Wilton, cast decades ago in Chicago, or Schiller Park. Its brass swivel bolsters worn smooth from years of hands turning that base into position. Clamp something in its jaws today, and it still grips true, the spindle still pulling straight and even. That's exactly the way Hugh Vogel designed it to back when he was still figuring out his own company's name. Next to it sits a newer Wilton, cast more recently in Taiwan. Same bullet shape stamped into the same familiar logo. Both say Wilton. Both still close tight and hold their work. But only one of them was built by a company that knew, firsthand, why that shape mattered in the first place. A name can survive almost anything you throw at it. The understanding behind it is a lot harder to keep alive. If you want more stories about the brands that outlived the people who built them, subscribe to the channel. There's another one next week.